Today, we're going to talk about voter suppression in Georgia in the 2018 election. Now, that's been quite a while ago, so you may wonder why I'm talking about this now, but that's because Stacey Abrams is in the news once again, and we're going to talk about that. Before we do, let's actually look at what happened in that election. In 2018, you had Stacey Abrams running against Brian Kemp for the governor's seat in Georgia. Now, Brian Kemp was eventually declared the winner, and basically since then, Stacey Abrams and many other people have said that she was essentially cheated out of the election because of voter suppression. Don't take my word for it, let's look at some headlines. We have from The Guardian, textbook voter suppression, and then from Rolling Stones, Brian Kemp's voter suppression tactics take a hit in court, and then also from CNN opinion piece, don't let Brian Kemp steal Georgia's gubernatorial election. Not only that, but we also have Stacey Abrams and several candidates right now for the presidency who have basically said the same thing. Here we go.
Stacey Abrams ought to be the governor of Georgia. When racially motivated voter suppression is permitted,
they are working hard to shut down our democracy. Massive voter suppression prevented Stacey Abrams from becoming the rightful governor of Georgia.
I do have one very affirmative statement to make. We won. Not only was he Secretary of State, he was also an architect of voter suppression. Yes. Because we can work as hard as we want, we can fight right. But if you're fighting against a system that is designed to oppress you, sometimes you got to fight a little bit longer than you planned.
Brian Kemp is a purveyor of voter suppression. And you know what, folks? We ain't going to let it happen.
Now, one thing that I will agree on is a lot of these articles point out the fact that at the time of the election, Brian Kemp was also the Secretary of State, which means that him and his office was essentially in charge of registering people to vote and overseeing everything there. So there is certainly a conflict of interest there. That being said, he didn't break any laws by running for governor at the same time he was still occupying that office. Personally, I think he should have recused himself because it would clear a lot of this up, but he did not, so here we are. Now what I'm going to do is go through a lot of the claims that they often make, Stacey Abrams included, and talk about why I just don't think they make sense, why there's not enough evidence, in my opinion, that there is voter suppression that caused Stacey Abrams to not win the election. So the key point they focus on is that Brian Kemp's office was responsible for canceling, as it says here, about 1.4 million voter registrations since 2012. Now that's a lot of people. There's really no way to look at it. When you read that, maybe if you're a Democrat, you'll think that how that basically works is you have, let's say Jimmy, they see that Jimmy is a Democrat, and so they toss him in the trash because they don't want him to vote. And that's not how it happened at all. He did not create the process. He did not create these laws. He was just doing what is already on the books. So what did Brian Kemp do? And what's the process here? Well, if you haven't voted for 3 years, you will receive in the mail a letter telling you need to confirm your address within 30 days. If you don't confirm that address, you're put on an inactive list, at which point you have essentially 2 more general elections to either vote or just let yourself known to elective officials that you are still there or somewhere else. So the entire process takes about 6 years. And like it said here, I think this is really important to recognize. It's not as if after the first 3 years, you're automatically ineligible to vote. You're labeled inactive, but you can still vote. And since this takes 6 years, if we go back to the image we saw earlier, the 1.4 million is starting from 2012. So it wasn't clear if that is how many people moved to inactive or actually removed, because the 6 years from 2012 would take you to the 2018 election in which they could have still voted. So if these 1.4 million were put in inactive status, they still could have voted for either Brian Kemp or Stacey Abrams. So how is that suppressing their ability to vote? It doesn't make sense to me. Now, before we move on to the next point, if you appreciate getting facts backed up with sources like this, then go ahead and subscribe so you can always stay up to date with the things that I put out, and so you can get all the sources I give you down below in the description. Another point that I hear is that he closed 214 precincts or voting locations, again, since 2012. And that is not accurate. He is not responsible for what locations you can vote at. That is a local decision. Not only that, but he as well as many Democrats, opposed the closing of these precincts. Furthermore, the individual who was responsible for them actually ended up being fired. So it's not accurate to say that Kemp was responsible or, I guess, in any way affiliated with the closing of these polling locations, because I haven't seen any evidence that that is correct. As a matter of fact, he says that he's opposed it, so you'll have to show me evidence that he didn't. Now, one new law that he in fact did enact is called the exact match law. So how that works is basically they look at your voter registration information, specifically your name, and they need to make sure that that exactly matches the other information they have about you. So if, for instance, you have a hyphen in your last name that you forgot to include when you filled out your voter registration, then you would be put in pending status. And so they found that something like 53,000 voters in that election were put in pending status, and 70% of them were African Americans. So when you just look at that, again, it does look kind of bad on its face. It doesn't necessarily mean he was targeting African Americans, but it doesn't look good when 70% of the 53,000 are African Americans. All that being said, it is really important to note that when you're in pending status for your registration, you, however, can still vote as long as you take a photo ID to the polls. And it was also evident that there were a number of names that they purged that were not actually real people. So it's not as if they just, again, threw out 53,000 voters, because they could still vote as long as they went to try and vote with a photo ID. Now, as far as the disparity in race goes, Kemp is essentially saying that it's because of Stacey Abrams. So she founded in 2013 a New Georgia project where she would basically take a group of individuals and they would go to largely minority areas and help them register to vote. So according to Kemp and his office, a lot of the registration forms that they filled out in the New Georgia project were done very poorly. And so because of that, a large portion of the 53,000 that they put in pending status were African American, because that is specifically who Abrams was targeting, as she was targeting minorities to help them to vote. So again, I don't think it's accurate to say that not only did he stop them from voting, it's also not accurate to say that he targeted African Americans, because that just doesn't seem to be the case. Now again, when you're in pending status, you can still vote, and you have 26 months to fix the exact match issue. So that's over 2 years to fix it. So you could have voted in 2018, and technically you could still vote up until the 2020 election, depending on when it actually happened. In the 2014 election, there were about 2.5 million votes cast in Georgia. In the 2018 election, there were 3.9 million votes. So if Brian Kemp's goal was to suppress people who would go out and vote, he did a very poor job about it, because there were 1.4 million more people who voted in 2018 than there were in 2014, which is an increase of 56%. That is a fairly significant number, especially when you're looking at the fact that 2018 wasn't a presidential election. Presidential elections tend to get much higher turnout than local elections. But again, this was just a local election, and there was a 56% increase in voter turnout. So if he did try to suppress the vote, he essentially didn't do it well whatsoever. So all of these things together lead me to believe that she did not lose because of voter suppression, that she just lost. So now let's look at the election results, and we see that Brian Kemp actually only won by something like 50,000 votes, which is not a significantly high number. So I want to read a quote from Stacey Abrams about this. She said, quote, "I have no empirical evidence I would have achieved a higher number of votes." This was in a New York Times interview. So even though she and many other people are claiming voter suppression and that she lost the election because it was stolen from her, she herself said she has no evidence to prove that it would have been different otherwise. I feel like the burden would be on her to show that evidence before you then start saying that the election was stolen from you. Continuing on, when asked what she regrets about this election, she said, quote, "What I regret every day is that we could not stop Brian Kemp from bastardizing this whole process." Once again, she's essentially throwing him under the bus, saying he ruined the entire process, and I just haven't seen the evidence for that. Now, you may wonder why I decided to start talking about this today, because this is from 2018. And that is because recently, just a few days ago actually, she was interviewed by the New York Times, and in this interview, she made it clear for the first time in months that she will not run for president in 2020. Now, I think this is interesting that she had to clarify she would not, because people were essentially trying to push her, and there was a lot of speculation about it, which I don't entirely understand. I look at her, and then I look at Beto, both individuals who were very national figures in their respective races, but they both lost and are still somehow being propelled upward. Generally, how I imagine it would be is if you run at a local election and you don't win, that you would probably stay local until you then move forward piece by piece. But it looks like that doesn't happen with Beto. And I mean, Stacey Abrams actually isn't running, but the very fact that people wanted her and trying to push her to run kind of shows that same thing. That being said, she said that she would be open to a number 2 spot as vice president. So once again, basically her claim to fame, as far as I can see, why she's nationally known, is because she lost an election in Georgia. She claimed voter suppression, and now people basically love her. She is more or less AOC if AOC had actually lost her election but was still around absolutely everywhere claiming that it was stolen from her. That's who Stacey Abrams is, and frankly, I'm glad that she's not running for president because there's already 500,000 Democrats running, but the very fact that it was an idea that a lot of people had, I don't get that. So let me know what you thought about this down below. Were you following the news as it was happening in 2018, or did you learn something new here that you felt like should have been included in the news? If you still disagree with me, that's okay, but look at my sources before you make any, shall we say, unintelligent comments about this video, because I had plenty of those in my last video about Bernie Sanders, and I appreciate feedback, but if it's not constructive, if you don't have any argument, you just call me an idiot, that doesn't do anything. So look at my sources before you make a comment if you disagree. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on one of these videos before you take off, and I will see you next time.